I want to welcome you to this webinar that is being organized by the program. I want to introduce myself. I am Miguel Solana. I am the Enterprise Development Specialist at the Decent Work team for North Africa in the International Labour Organization. I am based in Cairo, and I think it's a pleasure to be here with you today, to be able to talk about something that I think it's fascinating, the way it's evolving currently, and I hope that the topic, how we're gonna go over it, it's gonna be of interest to you. And then let me just then get started. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the session, and then I will appreciate if you have questions. I mean, you can post them on the chat. I may not be able to go through all the questions in the chat as I will be presenting, because it's going to be at the same time, and I'm struggling a little bit with the two screens. But then I will go through the chat after the presentation, and then maybe you can have a small conversation if that's okay with you. Let me check the chat. I cannot see it all the time. Anyway, I cannot see the chat right now, so let's not lose more time on that. First of all, I want to talk to you a little bit around the agenda for today. I don't want to get started too much on the impact of COVID-19 on enterprises. I think it's all over the news. I will just want to share a little bit of data about that. And then I want us to move through the policy solutions in face of the pandemic. From the point of view of the ILO, we have been trying to think around like how to create solutions for it. And I think we came up with this idea of thinking around of the pandemic on three phases. The first one is around a generalized reduction in economic activity due to health measures. The second one is going to be on the reactivation of the business activity once the virus is contained. And I think we may be in some countries, and I mean, it's very hard to predict whether we will be going back to phase one over the rest of the year. Hopefully not, but I mean, we're very mindful of that. And then I think once the pandemic is over, we're thinking that there's going to be a recovery phase that will be extremely relevant. Let me actually, can we mute everyone in the meantime? Yeah, I will ask maybe someone else who's controlling the chat room to be able to mute everyone. So we're going to be talking about these three phases. Then I'm going to be talking a little bit about something that at the ILO we call social dialogue. I'm going to get into that later, and how social dialogue will be a very important tool for this. And then I want to share with you some resources on enterprise support that have been coming up through the pandemic. So you will have some links on the presentation that we will be sharing afterwards in PDF format. And then we will come to some questions and answers. So my first comment when it comes to this is that we're going to be having a global perspective on the issue. I don't want to get lost on very specific local things. I think most of the reality in terms of public policy around the response to COVID-19 is relatively shared by different countries. And then, of course, the policy response should be grounded on the specific context and circumstances of the country, but everybody's sharing a little bit the same situation now. This is part of the pandemic concept that everybody's equally touched. I think that we have to be thinking that phase one and phase two solutions are going to be somehow emergency interventions, and that the clarity that we can put in place for that will help us to speed up the recovery in the third phase. And I guess then we can get started. So as I said, I mean, let's go quickly a little bit through the impact of the COVID-19 on enterprises and what we have been living. And in this case, what I want to see is that we are a little bit the figures of the ILO said that around 81% of the world's workforce is in a partial or full lockdown, which is which is a huge number of people not being able to fully perform their economic activity as usually. And wait a second. Okay. And And in this case, what this has created, the fact that people cannot go to work, is the fact that there has been disruptions in the production of many goods. And this has sort of led to the fact that many enterprises have had to suspend or scale down their operations. And therefore, pretty much in the world of business and the enterprises, from the smallest, almost entrepreneurial mono enterprise to multinational enterprises, what we are seeing is that we're facing losses, mostly catastrophic losses, and that this kind of stopping the economic activities, creating operational or solvency problems. And actually, the ones that we observe are greatly touched are smaller enterprises. Which leads me to the second part. Wait a second. To understand, if we are creating, if we are a government and we have to take decisions on public policy, I think one of our first priorities is to understand who is the most vulnerable people, who are the most vulnerable sectors in this situation, so that we can create a response that goes accordingly. In this case, we can see that sectors like travel, tourism, hospitality, food service, retail, and manufacture, according to the ILO, they have been especially hit by the pandemic. Portions of the workforce are being laid off. This is what we have been observing. I wouldn't say not only in Egypt, but in most countries in the world. What we see is that workers in the informal economy with limited access to health services and social protection are being extremely vulnerable to. And that in terms of enterprises, we see that MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises, are the most vulnerable enterprises, pretty much because they have less cash reserves, which means that they have less means to be able to face the month-to-month, as we would be calling it now, to be able to pay salaries and run their fixed costs and keep operations running. So what is happening? That in these vulnerable segments, as I have said before, specific sectors of the economy, specific segment of the population, like the informal sector, specific part of the enterprises world. If we don't put in place public policies that aim to support what sort of their meltdown, we have very high risks that we would be falling into poverty. And actually the greatest problem would be, like, once they go back, how in the recovery phase would we be able to catch up with that? So I think the priority, as I said before, is a little bit around taking a little bit the steps to think that we can really act already in the emergency situations and take it into the future. What do we need to be thinking about public policy in the middle of this? I think governments have a huge power to be able to work on this. So I think we have to see that governments have the capacity to provide immediate relief to workers and enterprises, and to be able to make sure that the livelihoods and viability of businesses sort of remains there during the crisis. What's the reality of the government? I would say, I think it's that we have limited public resources. I think most of the developing and emerging world governments are already struggling in public finances. Therefore, this means that we need to be more creative to be able to come up with solutions that are realistic according to our budget capacities, but that actually are trying to address the real needs that people and enterprises are facing right now. I think the fact that we have limited resources means that we will have to be able to create public-private mechanisms to be able to create the solution, and that maybe also international cooperation partners will be involved in working on that. And this is, I mean, me sitting from the multilateral system at the UN organization, like how can we contribute to the public and private efforts in face of the pandemic. And I think the other very important fact that I think we need to be able to consider in terms of this pandemic, that some of the solutions need to be time bound. These are not programs that will arrive here to stay because of budgetary situations, but these are the programs that we need to keep in mind that they will have to be designed with a timeline of only a few months, sometimes maybe even weeks. So these are not policies that are long-term, but I mean, they're trying to really address the emergency right now and then set the foundation for a recovery, which will for sure have a longer-term approach. Then sort of coming into point 2 of the agenda, I want to then move into the different phases that we have identified in the ILO as a solution. I'm then talking around like phase 1, when we were talking about generalized reduction in economic activity and the measures to prevent the spreading of the virus. In this case, I think what is happening, and it is quite unique compared to other crises, economic crises that we have seen in the past, is that the disruption to demand is not due to money shortages this time, at least in the beginning, but it is due to public health constraints. It's due to the fact that we cannot go out and spend our money and go and work, provide our services, and so on. And this is what's creating what I would call the crunch in the activities. And therefore, when we are sort of heading, after being in a health crisis, into an economic crisis, it's like, what can governments do to mitigate recessions? And I think this is where we have a little bit around like the tax reduction solutions, increasing spending on social protection, and expanding public investment. What can we do more concretely in terms of private sector support? I would think that we can create credit lines for enterprises. We can provide businesses with a slower but steady supply of customers to allow them to cover their fixed costs. And I think something that is emerging around here that is quite interesting is like a little bit, how can we provide business continuity to enterprises so that they can save jobs and also be in a good position to recover quickly. So based on this, what can we do in terms of policy support for enterprises? I would say there would be very straightforward things. For me, the first one in terms of general support to enterprises is that governments do have an obligation to provide up-to-date, reliable, and timely information about the status of containment measures. This will allow enterprises of all sizes to be able to plan for their activities, for their staff, for their budgets, and so on. So the better that governments can provide information to enterprises, the better that they will be able to forecast and plan around. Then we have that at the country level, we have access to essential business inputs and other goods and services. It's going to be important to prevent the disruption of value chains, of service industry, and so on. I think the one consideration that remains here, and this is one of the new adaptations, is how can we keep up with basic health recommendations, what from the ILO we call occupational safety and health, to guarantee that there's no disruption in this essential business inputs. And I think this is part of the government duties, to be able to bring together the the OSH, the occupational safety and health elements, along with the that are required right nowadays in face of the pandemic, um, in order to keep ports working, freight and airports working, and all this different infrastructure that needs to be in place. Um, Third point that we have here for me is a little bit like, how can we have the government expediting payments that it has due to the private sector, tax returns, subsidies, and so on? It is important that the government is aware that the private sector is in need of this liquidity coming through to be able to pay salaries, pay the fixed costs, etc. Then we come to the fourth point. It's a little bit around the informal economy. This is one of the, previously I said, the most vulnerable sectors of the economy. And how can we have responses to the informal economy? I think what we are observing in many countries is that we are trying to provide access to these players in the informal economy through non-conditional transfers, for example, and using this opportunity that we're having to start registering these people, the small enterprises that would have access to certain support, to pave the way towards formalization. So I have to say that this is something that we are seeing in many, many countries. And I think it's extremely, I mean, it's one of the things that this crisis is providing us in terms of thinking, how can we use the support mechanisms as a first step into formality? And the other thing that we're observing, and that sometimes in terms of the public policies, it's maybe not being so clear, is around how the solidarity economy, meaning NGOs, associations, and so on, is being a vital network to support marginalized and vulnerable populations. Meaning we know that there is people that have been in dire need of support, and it is the solidarity economy that is being quite active there, and that the governments then sometimes, if they want to channel certain resources to more vulnerable groups, the solidarity economy is a good platform for this kind of things when it doesn't have a direct contact with the segments of the economy and the population. So this is the first element in terms of general support services for the phase one. I think also what we are seeing in many countries, and this includes developed countries, it is supporting enterprises to temporarily convert their production to help respond to the pandemic. What we are seeing is that governments, no matter where, are also trying to focus on using resources to save lives. This is a health crisis to begin with. Therefore, we can support enterprises to transform their production for services and goods that could be helping the government to face the pandemic. And I mean, and here we will be talking about temporary hospital facilities, beds and bedding, masks, medical equipment, hot meals and drinks, temporary shelter for staff brought in from other areas, etc. So this means that some enterprises could be sort of pitching in part of the solution. I mean, even like when I was looking for the images for a presentation, I mean, this is a picture of a woman in a General Motors factory in the US, where General Motors changed part of the production line to be able to produce face masks for the pandemic. So it means that private sector can adapt. I think therefore, we are seeing multinationals and large enterprises sort of changing their production. And then also the government could help smaller enterprises to do likewise by supporting the cost involved in shifting this kind of production, and by enabling smaller enterprises, meaning small, medium enterprises, to access public procurement processes to be part of these new businesses that are emerging during the pandemic times. Then we can move to one of the points that I think is one of the most important ones to understand for us, is how can we help enterprises to cover their fixed costs? You know, cover the fixed costs are pretty much around like the basic costs that the enterprise is running to run the business, including rent, salaries, and services, and so on. So if enterprises manage to cover their fixed costs, they will manage to go through this period without having to close, which I think it's quite important. And this is because MSMEs have less cash to be able to cover this cost over an extended period of time without economic activity. And therefore, I think this is the concept that we can do. Therefore, when we come to the options of what we can do from the public policy side, it is a little bit around temporarily waive or suspend collection of payments, meaning taxes, social security contributions, public utilities, and so on. I think that is one of the solutions. We're seeing that in many countries, these kind of payments are being deferred for a couple of months until enterprises can restart their economic activity and they're like pre-financed. Then we can provide enterprises at replacement rates for fixed costs. And this is, for example, countries like Canada are doing that. Based on previous tax filings, we can provide specific credit lines that allow enterprises to cover their fixed costs. And then we are having, and this is happening, maybe a little bit more on better off countries around like subsidies to cover labor costs. I mean, this is coming in the form of conditional on employment retention and based on the enterprise size. Something else that we have been seeing is around like governments working with the financial service industry, with the financial institutions to reschedule payments. I think this is making sense in some of the countries in Latin America that I've been seeing. I mean, we're seeing that the financial sector is refinancing most of the active portfolios of giving like periods of up to 6 months free of repayment for enterprises to be able to stand on their feet to the crisis. And the other thing that we're seeing that it's also been quite common, and almost every rescue package that is coming up is large lines of credit backed by government short-term liquidity guarantees, so that financial institutions are able to provide additional needed loans right now. So I think this is in terms of what we can do for the fixed costs. And I think the next part and this part of the pandemic and this initial phase and this sort of containment phase is like, how can we support the enterprises to adapt to new market circumstances? The markets are different. We're talking about social distancing right now, empty places, the need for empty places, and so on. Therefore, what can we do? I mean, it's like facilitating the access to ICT tools and platforms that enterprises can use to source locally now that borders are closed, for example, or mechanisms to maintain communication with clients. I mean, we have seen lots of companies being able to sort out communication with clients through WhatsApp, video conferencing, business deals happening online, etc. I mean, some part of the company of the economy has always had access to this kind of solutions. I think when we're talking about medium, small enterprises, I mean, this needs to be facilitated, for example. I think we can be talking about setting up platforms for business owners to network with peers with similar companies to share information and avoid the isolation on the solutions. There could be some shared investments at the industry level that could be interesting to start exploring these days. We could be thinking about web-based training on digital marketing and service delivery to increase online capacities. What I have been experiencing here in Egypt is sort of this emergence of all these new business models to be coming online, being able to advertise your products on different social media platforms and so on. Some people know how to do it, some others don't. And there may be a good case for also trying to create this support for the initial 2 phases. I think we're also talking about digital payment channels. I think this is also one of the most broad solutions that we're seeing in the developing and the emerging world. It's going to be interesting to see if this sort of is a good push towards mobile money. It is happening in Latin America, North Africa. So I think it's also one of the positive things that this could be bringing. And I think it's helping to adapt the business models to a changing demand and a consumer behavior. We are all behaving differently as consumers right now. We are all accessing the services that we used to require in a different way. And we need to be able to help enterprises to understand these changes and to be able how they will be able to do it. Um, so that was for phase one, I guess. So that was a containment phase. I think now we come to phase two, which is the reactivation of business activity once the virus is contained. And I think this is a reality. Many enterprises will need support to reinitiate operations and to gradually restart their economic activities. I think what we will be needing, seeing here, is going to be the need of having access to financial services, market recovery measures, alternative supply chains, and conducive business environment that enables enterprises to recover more quickly from the economic crisis. More punctual things that we could be thinking about here. It is easing access to credit and other financial services. This is sort of being a mantra at all different levels of the pandemic because we need liquidity. And then it's understanding that enterprises will have need to access to credit to cover short-term cash flow problems. That we may be needing subsidized leasing arrangements to purchase small productive assets, and that we may need to do investments to change certain things that we hadn't done before. Um, so, so this access to finance is going to be maybe one of the key elements here. I mean, then I already spoke with that before. I mean, the activation, the facilitation of digital payment systems to reach new customers and receive remittances. And then we could be thinking about policies from the side of the government to bring liquidity into the market through private institutions, meaning how can the government create the relevant guarantee schemes so that the financial system can pour money into the real economy. Um, and then we would be thinking about like how can we access credit, therefore we have low or no interest loans through public and private financial institutions. We could have lines of credit for trade activities. We could be having governments underwriting the risk to ensure that loans go to smaller enterprises, and we could be having guarantee and emergency insurance, guarantees and emergency insurance. And here I think it's also relevant to think who are the key players for this. I mean, we will have financial institutions, of course, but we could also be thinking about microfinance institutions, financial cooperatives, and other financing institution that is serving the MSME sector. Another point for this phase two could be around rolling out a demand policy. I think what happens in this part of the crisis is that after a crunch in terms of economic activity, I mean, what enterprises need is customers with cash to spend. Therefore, and we have already started seeing that, there's been unconditional cash transfers to help families to go through the crisis and to keep the economy alive. On both sides, from the side of the families that need these resources, but also on the side of the who will be providing the services and products. And we have to see how long, this is the time-bound element, how long do we need to have this kind of transfers to the people and the enterprises to be ongoing. We could be thinking around how to stimulate demand. And this could be done through employment-intensive investment, meaning construction, infrastructure, and so on. Oh, sorry. Government procurement with preference given to MSMEs. I mean, this we've talked about before, but I mean, governments procure a diversity of products and services where SMEs could be more actively participating. And finally, we could have tax incentives to stimulate local sourcing of multinational enterprises. How can multinational enterprises also source more locally in order to support the local economy? And I think the other thing that will be happening is a lot around restoring consumer confidence in the safety of in-person transactions and to restore purchasing habits to support shops, hotel, restaurants, and Provence. So I mean, this comes back to my first point around like having clear and relevant information at the relevant moments. I think we will need also this kind of information from the governments when certain activities can go back, when certain things don't run risk, if certain measures like mask and distancing is possible, how can we reactivate some of these things? Then the second point for the third point for this phase three is around maximizing the use of near markets. What we have realized, and I think every country in this world has realized, that we are vulnerable to disruptions in supply chains that are concentrated in specific production sites. I mean, I guess we have seen that we are somehow, for many things, we're very independent, for example, from China, and that if China stopped, then we would be struggling in our national markets to have access to specific products and so on. Therefore, how can we be able to also help governments at the city level, subnational regions, and so on, to create better ties for digital platforms that could create markets for different products more locally, for investments, for inputs, for final products and technology. So pretty much how can we bring closer this kind of solutions? Okay, so I can see the questions out here. Perfect. So how can we do that? And I think this is going to be getting more interesting. It's also a little bit about big data analyses and how can we use big data to be able to scope nearby markets where we could be able to diversify our products, but also our sourcing. So I think this could be an interesting application of big data analysis. And then something that is very clearly policy, like in terms of policy making, is the fact that we need a more agile and responsible business environment. I think what's happening is that there are new business models emerging. For example, distance service of clients, supply based on real-time demand, online operations, new products, new services. I mean, there's new things happening too. And I mean, so which means that there's like new enterprises, new ideas that could be coming in the market. Therefore, governments, this is an opportunity for governments to prioritize the simplification of expediting procedures for new enterprises, and to help old enterprises to be able to alter their business propositions, meaning there could be like new things that could be coming up to the markets. And what are the things that we could do from the government point of view? I mean, thinking, for example, waiving registration fees and minimum capital requirements, as well as fast tracking procedures to register and issue licenses through online platforms. I think this also, the government has an opportunity that we're having to work online. So how can we move to online platforms to serve enterprises too? As I was saying before, in terms of information, is providing clear guidelines on any new tax measures. Then we can be thinking about fast tracking public procurement procedures and simplifying them for MSMEs. This has been quite present in the previous recommendations. Fast tracking of investments authorizations on priority areas like health, infrastructure, devices, for example, being able to import ventilators for hospitals and so on. That then again touch reducing customs procedures and fast tracking of import and export activity, meaning like how can we make sure that our products can also be on the other market faster, and adopting emergency procedures to simplify enterprise restructuring and make business shutdown processes less onerous. I mean, it's going to be a reality. Many enterprises are going to fail. This is a crisis. Therefore, the easier we make it for enterprises that are failing to be able to fail, it's going to be easier for these people that are involved in this to be able to come up with new ideas and to get started with something new instead of getting stuck in this kind of processes of bankruptcy and shutdown. Then I'm moving to the phase of recovery, almost through. And as I said, you know, like despite all the efforts that we can do in phase 1 and 2, I mean, enterprises, the private sector will be quite damaged after the shutdowns and at the containment phases. And we need to be able to help them to regain revenues and start managing the accumulated debt that is happening right now and the deferred payments that we were proposing in the previous section. So here the duty of the government will be to help the private sector to recover as quickly as possible by interventions that strengthen the position of enterprises to boost their revenues and can pay back their loans and deferred payments and so on. And here it's also going to be mindful of the needs of the informal economy in this recovery moment, to consider the interventions that could help the informal economy to redirect their services to less saturated market segments. You know, the informal economy is sometimes always very present in very saturated segments. Everybody's doing sort of the same activities, and creating this shift into the formal economy. What can we do for the recovery? I think it's around, the crisis has shown us there's something around upgrading physical infrastructure to improve enterprises' access to supplies and markets, expanding the ITC, the IT services and so on that can provide access information and reach out to more customers. I think this is something that could be done in a more sustainable way. And also thinking, and it's a little bit of this idea, you know, these new services that will come out of the pandemic could create jobs and boost demand for new things. So I think, as I was saying before, there will be some of these new ideas that are emerging now as business solutions that will be creating opportunities for more jobs in the future. And then we have, this is my last part of this sort of phases of the solution, business services to support MSMEs. This is not new, but I mean, I think what I'm observing in the different markets is that more than ever, the skills, you know, like how to boost productivity, marketing skills, and so on, are needed to be able to make companies survive through the crisis. So we need to figure out how to make this and bring new elements like business continuity products and implement these new kind of things. So how can the government help through that? So this is like through broadening the availability of this kind of services for enterprises. I mean, this could be either through voucher mechanisms that are provided to enterprises to access this kind of like consulting services, business development services, or like training that could be available for enterprises to improve their own management capacities. And I think some of the lessons that we're having a little bit around this is like, how can we have a new economic recovery based on a more sustainable economy? And how can we create greater resilience for the future? I personally believe that this pandemic shows us that there could be other pandemics coming up, but that there could be more natural catastrophes and so on, and that this idea of resilience business models is going to be extremely important for the coming years. I'm just quickly screening the things. You will guys get the slides on PDF format. I'm going to share that with the organizers, and then you will be able to review the slides for the future. So, and then I'm going to move on. I think this was for 3 intervention phases. What I want to talk to you about now is a little bit about social dialogue. And social dialogue, you know, the ILO is a tripartite organization. You can see it in our logo. We are an organization that brings together the government, the employers, and the workers in one roof, and trying to create this tripartite interaction. And this is this interaction among social partners is what we call social dialogue. And this means that the ability of the government to be on the table with workers and employers meaning the private sector in a broader sense, is going to be key for this, because then the government will be able to listen about the needs that are happening and sort of the requirements that have that. So it is going to be around like the optimal level and duration of support mechanisms that we will be having, and taking into account the rights and needs of workers. So I think this social dialogue is an interesting mechanism for everybody to listen to each other and to have a little bit of a needs assessment and provide the relevant solutions that the needs are expressing. So for example, issues of discussion in terms of the social dialogue include alternatives to lay upstream, reduce work times, and reorganization of business operations, flexible methods to keep businesses operations running, strong and rapid tripartite joint actions that ensure the continuity of economic and social activities. So if you see, we could be talking together among governments and employers and workers to be able to come up with some of the solutions that the pandemic is requiring. And the other thing in terms of social dialogue can be happening at this higher level, but it could also happen at the enterprise level, you know, and then the government could be facilitating and encouraging this bipartite social dialogue, meaning at the enterprise level, management and workers could be coming to agreements. At the sector level, there could be also dialogue between the workers of particular industries with the employers in these industries and come up with recommendations and solutions for the industry. So I think it's also a very interesting solution that sometimes we forget that also some of the most relevant solutions are actually created at home based on the experience and needs that people are having in that industry. So just as I was preparing for this, I was also trying to make sure that I'm pretty sure that you're working all sometimes in some of these issues. And I wanted to share with you some of the resources that we have prepared at the ILO in face of the pandemic. So here I will be sharing the document. There's links to all of these different things. We at the ILO, we have created like a briefing note on interventions to support enterprises for the COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery. It's part of the things that I've been presenting here. We have restructuring for recovery and resilience in response to the COVID-19 crisis. This is a document around how to restructure organizations. How will you be having to negotiate, for example, limited working contracts, changing activities, and so on. We are having an interesting document on crisis responses by the cooperatives in the social solidarity economy. We have something that is very interesting that many people don't know it exists, but there's something like the business help desk, which is it's a little bit like an interface that the ILO has developed to be able to provide to clarify questions of enterprises around international labor standards and better practices in terms of in the international perspective. So this is this business on COVID-19. I mean, there is whole new sections on advice to enterprises to know what to do. The ILO has an office-wide, a global thing called COVID-19 and the World of Work. This is our main resource center at the whole of ILO. For this, there's also a catalog of country policy responses. I think it's quite interesting. And also we have an ILO monitor, like it's an international labor organization. We are also monitoring what's happening in the labor of work, in the world of work in the context of the pandemic. So these are ILO resources. But then also the world is not only about the ILO and our tripartite structure. We're very aware that there's other things happening. So we have the IOE, the International Organization of Employers. They have a business response platform. OECD has an SME response, policy response website. The International Trade Center, which is this joint organization run between the World Trade Organization and the United Nations, is also having a website on supporting small businesses through the COVID-19 crisis. And then there's IMF policies responses, UNDP pandemic response. There's a data hub from the UN Federated Network. And then there's also the Oxford University COVID government response tracker. So I think these are also global resources that I think is going to be interesting. And now we come to the point of questions and answers. We have around 10-15 minutes. How to do it? I see some questions here. Maybe I can try to quickly go through them. And then I can go. So I will read the first question and I'll try to answer. And then we can be moving through the questions. The first question is from Inas Fatim. What does ILO have in store in terms of work environment after COVID-19 when it comes to vulnerable groups within enterprises, since they are the first to be affected? As I said, the ILO is an international organization. We don't have sometimes very direct support mechanisms to enterprises because we work through the government or through projects. But in this case, I think from the point of view of the ILO, and if you go to the ILO, first of all, the ILO COVID-19 page and one of the links that I sent, there's one element, for example, where the ILO has already issued advice to governments and enterprises on, for example, new occupational safety and health practices that should be in place in the coming months for enterprises. This is to protect everyone, not only the most vulnerable groups. I think we will be trying to work with governments to make sure that we are addressing that responses also flow to more vulnerable groups, and this has been present throughout the presentation. Things about considering the informal economy, MSMEs. I presented what are the most vulnerable between parts of society, enterprises that we should be taking into account through the pandemic, and being able to coming up with policy solutions that governments can put in place. And I think there's going to be lots of position papers, not only by the ILO, but for example, there's going to be a lot about women, the situation of women already in the labor market in face of COVID-19. And I think the other thing that will be very important to be thinking about is going to be people with disabilities, and whether the pandemic is an opportunity for us to improve working conditions for people with disabilities. Gonna move into next question from Heba Yusri. In phase 2, wouldn't be an opportunity to emphasize on responsible production and responsible consumption? Totally agree. I think responsible production and consumption is not something that is related to the pandemic. It's around transitioning our economies to a more sustainable approach, which is part of the global development agenda. So I think, yeah, these are issues where we could use actually the pandemic as an opportunity that, for example, if we're going to have rescue packages, investment packages for enterprises to restructure that maybe we didn't have this resources available before, we can try to make this kind of conditions into the production and consumption elements. So yeah, I think, yeah, this is part of the global development agenda, and this is just one more opportunity to try to emphasize that. I'm going to be sharing the slides later, I promise. It's PDF format. Next question is, how can businesses manage their financing activities during this situation? This has been the question that everybody around the world has been setting up. I spoke a lot about that. It is around access to finance, supporting the financial system to create the correct public, the access to resources. Access to finance is by far already, even without the pandemic, #1 hurdle for enterprises. So this becomes even more relevant right now. So it's going to be, how can governments really try to create an inclusion agenda in the middle of the pandemic by providing guarantees for enterprise investments and so on? How can we provide more accessibility to financial services to companies in the informal economy? This is another of the solutions that is coming up. So yeah, I think all rescue packages coming up right now are involving financing, and I think it's going to be, this is going to be a collaboration between the public and private sector to be able to get there. And then let me. I have another question. How will this affect the stock market? I mean, this is affecting the value of enterprises because the future cash flows of enterprises are uncertain. I think we have seen that there are sectors that have been booming, like online deliveries, Amazon's stock value, like market capitalization has been exploding over the past weeks. Access to online content has been exploding. Applications like Zoom, as we're using right now, are also being extremely popular. So I think we will see that there's there's sectors of the economy that are going to boom, and there's sectors of the economy that are going to suffer. I think the overall picture is like the whole of the economy is suffering because of disruptions in lots of things. So yeah, I think the how will this affect the stock market will depend on the sector, the enterprise, and the market. Next question. Shouldn't the development agenda be changed in light of the pandemic? Shouldn't the ILO question the idea of formalization of the informal sector? The informal, wait a second. The informal sector might already be surviving better than the formal sector. The reason they don't want to go formal is that they will suffer from unfair formal and informal rules such as bribes. I don't think the development agenda, this is a very personal thing, should change in light of the pandemic. I think the development agenda will be adjusted to be able to respond to the pandemic. I think the UN, and maybe I can share that with you, I read that the UN will issue later tomorrow by the Secretary General, like sort of how the UN will be trying to address a response. But I don't think that this takes away the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think the Sustainable Development Goals are there. They will stay. They're relevant for their nature of the world. I think the question right now is like, how can we keep working towards those goals in face of less economic growth, less resources, and so on. And this will be quite tricky. So I think it's more how will we adapt to that, and not forget that we have a development agenda in place that has reason, meaning our existence in this planet has impacts on the planet and societies, and we need to be able to create the right kind of solutions for that. The formalization, like informal sector, I spoke about that. I believe that, yes, I understand that there's not many incentives for the informal economy to formalize, and that's because they don't get many services from the government and hurdles. And this is why we also think this is an opportunity for us to understand that enterprises will formalize if they get something out of formalization. And they will be then contributing into the system. So I think the idea is to be able to work through the red tape, diminish red tape, meaning reducing the corruption that could be happening, and showing that actually being formal is something, mechanism that gives us access to something, meaning services, social protection, that should be working, and that this is an opportunity for the state to rethink what we're doing. Is that the state is there to collect taxes, yes, but the taxes are to provide services to the people and the enterprises. And the state, theoretically, we want to formalize companies because we want to provide them services. So this is an opportunity to show that the public sector can provide the relevant services, the relevant solutions when it's necessary. So that these people in the informal economy, this informal sectors, feel that contributing to the state is a mechanism also to be able to reap off the benefits of having access to certain services. So I guess those are the questions I got in the chat box. So yeah, okay. I don't know if there's any more questions. I open the floor. And
I just want to thank you, Miguel Solana, on behalf of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy Executive Education, and all the participants here for this very informative and very interesting session. And I just also want to say that we have recorded the session. It's available. It will be available on our website for anyone who wants to revisit or has had any disruptions due to internet disconnects or something, and those who were not able to join us. So it will be on our website. We will be sending emails out with that. And we want to thank you again very much, Miguel. And of course, if anyone wants to join in and ask any questions or comments, please. Hello?
Yeah, I hear someone, so go ahead.
Okay, if anyone wants to say anything before we close the session.
Yeah. And in any case, I will share the presentation. And you have my email, and if you want to reach out to me with questions, I will be available for answering them.
All right. Thank you very much again, Miguel Solana, for this. It was really interesting and informative. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wish you a great afternoon then.
Yes.